My name is Arun Dayanandan. I'm from Concordia University as well, and I study animal behavior, specifically in fish, but on a general term, I'm looking at fish mating behavior. I'm here as part of the Shastra Indo-Canadian Institute's Research Fellowship, as well as the FRQNT, which is a provincial fellowship back home. And the main goal of being here is to meet all of you, collaborate, share some really cool knowledge, visit places, and just really get to know everything that's happening here in India, and hopefully lead to some larger, further collaboration. So do not be shy at any time to ask questions, even if it's in the middle of my talk, but we'll have time at the end as well. So the name of my topic, or the talk, is the effects of elevated background predation risk on female mate choice and offspring behavior in a tropical fish species. So actually, you know what, before I start, I'm actually going to just give this a shot. Let's see if this works in the presenter mode. Do you have presenter mode of this computer? Presenter mode, there we go. Oh, okay. That's okay. What we will do is we'll explore this together. So the main part of my talk, I'm going to start by talking about what is female mate choice and mate selection. Female mate choice is just more interesting to me. There is male mate choice as well. That is a whole other topic, but I'll be talking about it from the female perspective. There's then 5 major hypotheses as to why this has occurred across evolutionary time, and then from there I'll be moving on to what variation exists in female mate choice, because that has a very important factor when we're looking at evolutionary history. From there I'll move on to the costs of female mate choice and why it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation when it comes to choosing a mate. And then I'll move on to predation, and that's where I'm really excited because I like predators, because predators means fear and risk, and that always leads to much more interesting questions in my opinion. From there I'll talk about my major experiments, the first experiment, and then I'll put that into the context of maternal effects. And you'll see why when I get to that section, why actually mate selection can be seen as a type of maternal effect. I'll talk about the 4 major types of maternal effects, and I will close with my other major experiment that I'm working on as part of my thesis. So without further ado, what is female mate choice or mate selection? Well, it's a good question, Arun. Well, so the main thing is that there's a number of different species on this planet, and they are, they're beautiful, as you can see. And mate choice is the reason for a lot of these structures, these conspicuous structures in ornamentation. Whether we're looking at brown anoles and their dewlap, we're looking at peacock jumping spiders and their dances that they do, we're looking at actual peacocks and their huge heavy tails, we're looking at dung beetles, interestingly enough, when they kind of evolve these large structures, these horns, and of course human beings as well. In some situations more than others, we can really see that mate selection taking place, such as in a nightclub. And if anyone hasn't seen it, there's a really cool video called by Baba Brinkman, who's made the rap guide to evolution. He does a whole rap about mate selection in nightclubs. So definitely check that out if you're interested in seeing what it looks like on a human perspective. I will not rap for you, not today, maybe one day, but he does it a lot better than I could, so I suggest looking that up. So when it comes to history of mate selection, it hasn't always been as cut and dry. And the reason for that is because people have generally not really looked at mate choice as a major influence of evolutionary biology and in terms of selection towards these large ornaments and colors. So on our far left is our godfather, or rather father of evolution, Charles Darwin, and when it came to him, he believed that only higher animals were able to choose based on aesthetics, and choose things that were, what one might say are pretty and not pretty. Kind of contrasting with that, we had his compatriot, Alfred Russel Wallace, he believed that there is nothing special about animals. Animals cannot pick based on what they choose. Only humans can. We have our preferences. I might like the color blue. Kyle might like the color purple. Even if he's wrong, that's doesn't really matter. But the point is, Alfred Russel Wallace believed that animals are not able to make that decision. But in the middle, we have Ronald Fisher, and Fisher was the first one to propose the idea that, in fact, it is an important driver of evolution. In fact, the choice for these traits, which we will then refer to as secondary sexual traits, are actually is a major part of why we see the ornamentation and coloration that we do see today. And from there, we've gotten about 5 hypotheses as to the kind of origins, the reasons behind female especially, mate selection. And so I'll just go into those very briefly. The first one is called the sexy son hypothesis. The idea here is that females will choose males with traits that are that will lead to having male offspring being preferred. So it's kind of an indirect kind of effect in that the females are looking at one generation below. And there's this process that occurs called a Fisherian runaway process. And what happens is females will choose a male with the idea that her male offspring will be very attractive. And from there, she'll also pass on her traits, which is her preference for those kind of traits. So what ends up happening is you get males that look a certain way and females that have a preference for the way that male looks. And so it kind of becomes a spiral where you end up getting these, essentially you get the males looking at the way that female thought was attractive, and you get females, all her daughters, that believe that specific trait is attractive. So that is the sexy son hypothesis. And so this leads to things such as sexual dimorphism, because the males will start to look very different from the females. The second one is the good genes hypothesis. This is more of a direct effect. And the idea here is the females are selecting for traits that are honest signals as to what are good, healthy traits. What's a good, healthy male? This is, again, direct, the reason being that it happens between the male and the female, strictly speaking on what she thinks of the male. And it also affects both the males and the females, their offspring rather. So both sons and daughters are affected by the choice in terms of fitness benefits. I use two examples here. I use muscles in one, I use high heels in another. The reason being I want to illustrate what honest signals are. So muscles can be seen as an honest signal. If someone has a lot of muscles, they're big, chances are they're pretty strong, right? So that means that if you look at muscles, usually if someone has muscles, they're not going to be that weak. So it's an honest signal. On the other hand, high heels can be seen as almost a dishonest signal. The reason being that, high heels, if someone wears high heels, it basically makes it look like they can carry children better. But once those heels are off, well, that all disappears and the truth comes out. So really that's not an honest signal. So again, kind of coming back to the human example of things, this is a good example of what these honest signals are. So this is what females are looking when they're choosing their mate across animals. And no, fish don't wear high heels, although that would be very interesting. The next hypothesis are the sensory bias hypothesis. And this is that females already select for certain traits, not specifically for a reproductive or fitness advantage, but maybe they just like something. They like certain sounds with a certain frequency. Maybe they like certain smells, certain chemical smells. Or they might have a color preference, red or blue. And so what's happening is the way this hypothesis explains it is that the males are actually kind of hijacking this response, and if they notice, okay, well, all the females seem to like blue, they might start to tend to, just over time, they'll just naturally have more blue because the females are just selecting for it, and this might have no actual reproductive advantage. So this is kind of just an indirect way that this is occurring. So it's a sensory bias. The fourth hypothesis is the compatibility hypothesis, and this is the idea that there are complementary genes when it comes to males and females. And in fact, if we look at the major histocompatibility complex, we can see that in humans, women will tend to choose men that have a complementary allele. The reason being that their offspring would have an immunity, which is kind of a combination of both. So this is an idea that there's this complementarity between the males and the females when it comes to their offspring survival. And the last hypothesis is the handicap hypothesis. And this was brought up by an Israeli scientist known as Zahavi. And he was essentially saying that males will develop these traits as a way of almost displaying the fact that they're so strong that some of these traits, they don't have any real effect on them. So when we think of a peacock's tail, a weak peacock might have a smaller tail because if he had a bigger tail, well, he'd probably get eaten or fall off and be too heavy. Whereas the larger ones are able to just kind of see, look at my huge tail, yes, this is holding me back and it makes it easy for tigers or something to come catch me, but the fact that I can survive with this really heavy thing means that chances are, I'm a fit male. And so this handicap is a percentage of its overall fitness levels. It's kind of looking at this as a way to judge the actual fitness of the individual. And that's really the most important thing when it comes to selecting a male in most of these hypotheses. It's really trying to judge how fit is the male and what is the effect that's going to have on the offspring. But things are, again, not always cut and dry, and so we have variation in female mate choice. And this can actually change the way that this mate selection process takes place. And for example, we have two major types of variation. And the reason actually I should mention that is because when there's increased variation in female mate choice, the end result is that we do not have this directional selection towards, only males with big muscles or only antelopes or something with huge horns. There ends up being a whole kind of melange mix of different traits that we can see within a population of males. And so the two main types of variation that we see amongst female mate choice are choosiness and preference. And so choosiness refers to essentially how much effort she's willing to put into finding a mate. If there's a really, really attractive guy all the way over there, but a not so attractive guy over here, if she's feeling kind of lazy, she might choose the not so attractive guy simply because it takes way more energy to get over there. There's other factors that can occur. Maybe she didn't get enough sleep, maybe she hasn't had enough food, maybe her blood glucose is going down. The point is, there's a choosiness level inherently built into the variation here. The second one is the preference. So the way that a female ranks and orders what she finds attractive and what she doesn't find attractive. So going back to the example of red and blue, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is inherently better than the other. However, if a female finds that, one female thinks that the red male is better and the other female finds that the blue male is better, well, it's just their preferences. And so this can also create this larger variation in a pool when we're looking at male traits. And this occurs not just for colors, this occurs for size, it can occur for ornamentation. So when I mention these traits, there's a variety of traits that this can affect. This variation itself can take place between populations, it can take place within a population, but it can also take place within individuals. And so this inter-individual variation, intra-individual variation is what we know as behavior. Or rather, behavior is a type of it. So when we look at things such as time of the day, this can affect an individual's choice. Again, those energy levels, things like that. So it's really this within individual variation, which I personally find to be very interesting. There are three major factors as to what influences this variation. I kind of already mentioned one with the time and the energy constraints. One of them is genetic. So in this species of butterfly, we've actually seen, or moth, we've actually seen that there are two morphs of females. Some are white and some are yellow. And the white morphs tend to actually choose males of a specific color, whereas the yellow morphs tend to choose a male of a different color. And this is heritable. So what we're seeing is this divergence and possibly even speciation occurring because these morphs are choosing two different colors. There are environmental factors. So again, the time and energy cost of sampling can be dictated by the environment. Territory resource quality. Fiddler crabs, for example, the females will tend to choose larger burrows. So if a smaller male has a bigger burrow, he's good to go. Resource quality, again, it's all these things that change the spatial dynamic of a region. Signal detection and discrimination, this is a really interesting one, especially as the world is moving towards more and more urban ecology studies taking place. And as we build cities, we're getting much more noise. A lot of cars are driving through. We're seeing birds and squirrels, in fact, change the way they communicate with each other because they cannot hear each other over the sound of the city. And so especially in a place, coming here to India, it's my first time in India, seeing, just the sheer magnitude of the cars that could be, on the streets at some points, especially in Delhi, for example. I can't imagine birds being able to communicate very easily above all this noise. So in some cases, they are switching their way of communicating, but in other cases, what this means is it's changing the way they're able to discriminate between different sounds or different sights. And lastly, predation risk. I'll talk a little bit more about predation risk a little later, but this kind of differences in how likely you are to be eaten does significantly affect the way that females will make their choices. Lastly, we have social factors. So, for example, there are interactions between males. This is one of my favorite examples. It's the mannequin, lance-tailed mannequin. It's a small bird with its red head. What they do is they get into these big groups and they'll practice dancing and they'll actually kind of form these dance troupes of all males. And what will happen is then, once they've kind of practiced enough, they'll go find a female and they'll all line up in a row in front of her and they'll dance. And the female will judge the dancers based on the quality of all the dancers, essentially how well they can all keep in step. But she will only mate with the leader. So now we have this male-to-male interaction because who becomes the leader? And so we're not quite sure of that just yet. But this is an example of male-to-male interaction affecting the way that a female then chooses who to mate with. We can see variability in males. We can see the long-tailed widow bird, for example, and their huge tails. Female-to-female competition in razorbills. They are notorious for extra pair population, which means that even though you might have a mating pair, oftentimes the male will mate with another female and try to spread his genes. But the females, upon seeing this, will go and attack the male and then attack the female as well, like a jealous wife. would do, and so that can also affect if the female on the extra pair copulation side doesn't see it worthwhile being attacked, she may not choose a really high quality male simply because there isn't that ability. She doesn't want to deal with it, basically, all that drama. Nobody likes to deal with drama. Female mate copying as well is another thing. So in lecking behavior such as antelope and deer, generally when it comes to mating in some situations, again it's all environmentally dependent, what we see is that females will tend to, they'll get harassed a lot. If it's just random mating in general, they'll become harassed. And thank you. Yes. And I love this, I love getting tea, yes. So when it comes to female mate copying, they'll be harassed quite a bit if they're just kind of on their own doing their thing. But if a female sees that all these other females have chosen that one male, well, one, it's way easier for her. She doesn't even have to think about it. But two, she can just go hang out with all these other females and they're not going to harass her. So it's a lot safer. There's safety in those numbers, and it's better for the female to go and just choose the male that is already surrounded by all the other females. And lastly, we have operational sex ratio. What operational sex ratio means is essentially the number of reproductively active males to number of reproductively active females. So in a situation where, for example, there's so many males, well, the female can afford to be very choosy because there's so much choice. But in a situation where there's not enough males, well, the female has to go with whatever is in front of her, or whatever she can find. We can see this, for example, especially in deep sea species like anglerfish, where there's so much distance between species that effectively, you know, you're lucky. If you find another one of your species, you better mate with them because there's a good chance you may never find another one again. So operational sex ratio has a big part to play in terms of this variation. But like I was saying earlier, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, but that's all environmentally dependent, depending on the context. The reason being that, you know, whether you make a choice or you don't make a choice, there are going to be costs incurred. So I'll go into a little bit about the costs of actually making that choice. So when a female has to go and make a choice, there's some cost to the searching time. So the amount of energy that she's spending as well as the amount of time it takes to go find a male. And there's also, during the assessment itself, there are problems. There can be some costs associated, so she can be harassed, like I mentioned earlier. There's higher chances of diseases and parasites being transmitted because by assessing males, she actually has to get close enough to all the males, and so there is a higher chance of these diseases being transmitted. And finally, even during choosing, during mating itself, animals are very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable time. You might have seen, we've noticed these different beetles all around the campus these past 2 days mating, and they're just sitting ducks. You find them on the middle of the road. You know, it's easy for a predator to come and get a 2-for-1 deal buffet walking around as they're mating because they can't go anywhere. During, of course, the breeding coloration, if she's choosing a nice, colorful, well-ornamented male, well, it makes it very easy. The reason she found this guy was because of, let's say, bright colors. Well, it's the same reason why a predator will find the same male. So there can be danger associated with that. Lost mating opportunities is a big one. And if she picks one male, she's essentially, in a literal sense of the term, putting all her eggs in one basket in this sense. And so what ends up happening is that if that male ends up either not being good or something happens, well, she's kind of at a loss in that sense. So there are consequences to actually making a choice. And so what we've seen, especially with fish specifically, is that when we have females in wild populations where there's a lot of predators, the females will actually tend to choose males that are not noticed by the predators. So in this case, between the Trinidadian guppy, which I'll talk about a little later, between the bright males and the dull males, if there's a lot of predators around in the wild, she'll tend to choose the duller colored males simply because she will be less likely to be noticed when she's mating, so she won't get eaten. Her offspring will not be very bright and very blue and orange, so they won't get eaten. And there's a good chance that the male that she's mating with won't be eaten either. And so this initially was likely due to predation on those bright colored males, but natural selection has effectively continued these traits, and that's why we see it through sexual selection, this divergence of traits between dull males and bright males. And so that brings me to predation on female mate choice. So there's a number of different ways that females can, or rather the predation risk can vary when it comes to predation. And this predation will rather there's a change, the amount of predation is variable, and that will then change the variability of the female mate choice. And so she might alter her behavior when there's predators around, she might completely cut out certain behaviors when there's predator around, or she might even reverse the behaviors to a previous time in evolutionary history. Now that assumes that at some point in her past she has been in an environment, either hers or her ancestors have been in an environment where there are lots of predators present. And that means that she might reverse to a previous stage, or rather her behavior will go to a previous stage. And that is something that we specifically in our lab, we look at. So I'll get into that in a second. But first, why do we care about predators? Well, there are two major problems with predators. There are direct or consumptive effects. Effectively, you don't want to wind up like that poor bird on the bottom. You'd rather be the bird on the top. You don't want to be the one eaten. So being eaten is not fun for anybody involved, except for, I guess, the predator. And so that is the most obvious effects of predation, why you want to avoid it. But also there are indirect or non-consumptive effects. So these guys are actually not dead. This frog and this opossum are playing dead. And the reason for that is that they have this innate behavior to play dead when they're threatened, when they're afraid, when there's a predator around. And this will likely increase its chances of survival. And now it's an innate behavior. So even if there are no predators around, if you scare one, they'll kind of reverse to this time where there were predators involved, and they'll just play dead. And this can affect foraging, habitat use, growth rate, life history strategies, and of course their development and timing of development when we're looking at predators and their effects on these different behaviors and different elements of animal life strategies. And so this brings us to natural selection. Of course, I can't introduce a talk with a picture of Darwin without talking about natural selection. I feel like that'd be heresy. But what we should see is that there should be individuals. Yeah.
This goes against the very basis of honest signaling.
Okay. Does it?
It does.
Okay. How so?
The fact, let's take peacock for example.
Yeah.
Honest signaling is it has a burden and it shows it has survived with the burden, so it's probably stronger than other female, so it will be genetically more fit. So it's honest signaling.
It could also be handicap hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah.
This works only if there is predation.
Yeah.
If there is no predation, this is not honest signaling, it has no effect.
Yeah.
Therefore, honest signaling requires predation and ostentation in the presence of predation.
Exactly. There needs to be some environmental dependent effect.
Therefore, for a species to give up ostentation in the presence of predation would go against the logic of honest signaling in the presence of predation.
It would, assuming we're looking in the case of a peacock, because the structures cannot be changed as easily, but behaviors are able to change like this, right? So when we're looking at natural selection, we can also look at the time period of natural selection. We can look at it on a shorter time scale, which usually affects behaviors, but we can also look at these longer time scales when we're looking at things like ornamentation and larger structures,
That
right?
presupposes that behavior can be facultative.
It does. Most of behavioral ecology runs into that
That
supposition.
need not necessarily be the case. Right?
Yeah, and that's where things can become very interesting, right? Because we also have to make certain assumptions when it comes to behavior. That, for example, it's hereditary, that there are these factors going to influence it. Like most things, I mean, as a behavioral ecologist, I have to jump into the into the face to make these kind of assumptions, to make the studies that we do. Have to run into these assumptions that we do see a heritable component that is then based on things such as predation, but that can also, like anything else, we can never put all our eggs in one basket. We can never be 100% sure of anything, and there's definitely going to be cases, possible edge cases certainly, but possibly even large numbers of cases where this is not the case. The peacock tail is a very interesting example actually, because we're still not really sure exactly which category it goes into, because it can be the good genes hypothesis, but it can also be a handicap hypothesis, right? And so the peacock tail ends up being used as an example for many forms of this selection, but it's for sexual selection. But but that's a great question, especially bringing up the peacock tail, because it's an oddball when it comes to a lot of these things, and it actually does underlie a lot of the issues we have with looking at studies in sexual selection, because we have to make our assumptions as to the causative agents behind why we see what we do. Right? Did I answer your question? We can come back to it for sure. Maybe we'll answer.
Ecology is not straightforward.
No, it never is. And that's one of the big kind of criticisms of ethology, right? It's that it's
it is deconstruction of a pattern in history which we don't know about.
Yeah.
So any deconstruction is as valid as any other deconstruction.
Exactly. And all we can do is look at the other environments around it and try to make we try to see if we can deconstruct this pattern and recreate it in other contexts. So for example, and I should actually get to that a little later, but when I talk about the context dependence of this, that's a huge part when we're looking at animal behavior in general, because we can never say that this is a pattern and this applies in all cases, because it's very much environmentally dependent. Possibly even within the same species. We might see some populations have certain traits just because they might be in a context or an environment where, for example, the operation-sex ratio might be different. We will see these in different cases, and that can lead to things like speciation over time. So the idea is that behavior ends up being kind of the first major phenotype that a lot of these, that natural selection can affect, but then this will then trickle over into much larger things like structures and more permanent things, or permanent at least on human time scales. So that's kind of where natural selection does come in. So when we're looking at, again, the predation risk and modifying behaviors, it doesn't really make sense for this large dog to be afraid of this tiny little guy here, right? But if he's constantly afraid, he'll lose mating opportunities, he won't eat, and there'll be a lot of different problems. So when it comes to actually reacting to a predator, these things need to be context appropriate. You can't always be afraid, you can't never be afraid, because both have their own consequences when it comes to these kind of things. And as natural selection will work, if you're always afraid, over time your genes will then kind of deplete in the gene pool, and that's really what we don't want when it comes to things such as natural selection. So it should favor individuals that can assess an area based on the predation risk that's involved, and then modify their behaviors accordingly, unlike that dog. But in fish, we do see this occurring with chemical cues, chemosensory cues. And we see this with alarm cues, and we see this with disturbance cues. And the kind of images I used here may give a little bit of a sense as to what the two are, but I'll go into them nonetheless. Alarm cues, they were called Schreckstoff by Carl von Freisch, 1941. And what these are, it's a chemical that's found in these cells under the skin of the fish. And these cells are actually stimulated by a parasite load or by UV exposure. But they've kind of been co-opted for another use. And this other use is to actually attract secondary predators. And there's actually two uses for this alarm cue, which is why it's really interesting. The first, and the reason why we think this occurred through natural selection, was that it was attracting secondary predators. So if you end up being this guy, for example, or even this guy here, if you get bitten, right, you would hope that maybe this guy smells the alarm cue that you're producing, and he comes and eats this guy. Right? So by attracting the secondary predators, when this guy's eating this guy, you might have a chance to escape. And similarly, if this one produces those chemicals, these ones might tune into those scents, and then maybe this guy can escape while this guy's getting eaten by him. So there is a reason for the kind of evolution of maintaining these alarm cells, because they're energetically costly to maintain. But they're very, very strong cues, and we see that not only will predators notice this, but we've also seen cases where essentially the other peers of this shark, or any fish really, can also cue in. So let's say this guy produces those chemicals, well, other fish of his size, his brothers and sisters and cousins, they can smell that chemical, and it's species specific, so they can actually know who just died or got injured and what just ate him, and whether they should be afraid of that or not. They can actually tell the size of the predator based on the alarm cues that he's producing. And this actually is a little bit different than disturbance cues. Disturbance cues they're effectively just urinating around you. They're not species specific. It's most likely urea that caused that. But it does give a generalized response. So over evolutionary time, we've seen in this case in fish, they've started to cue into the fact that if they can smell this disturbance cue around the water, they don't know what exactly happened. All they know is that there was a scared fish. The fish could have been scared for any reason, and it could be due to a large predator, a small predator, it could have been anything. But just by looking into or smelling the amount of disturbance cue in the water, they can use this as an early warning signal and change their behavior accordingly. And that brings us to my first experiment, and that's looking at mate choice under elevated predation risk. So I wanted to see if you raise these females and under kind of this fear-like scenario, how will they change their behaviors? Because we've seen in wild populations that they are choosing these duller colored males. We do see this shift in mate preference, but we don't really know if this is truly taking place, so my goal is to see this in the lab. I made a few different predictions. One is that they will select these dull colored males, as we've seen in wild populations. I've also predicted that they'll have reduced decision-making time, the reason being that it's a lot better to just, make your choice and stick with it when there's predators around, because you don't want too much time floundering about in between. And also, I predicted that they'll just spend less time, again, moving between these males. Same reason, they'll just stay in one spot. I use a Canadian guppy as my animal model. You can see a female down here at the bottom, a male over here on the top. The bright orange coloration, and actually blue coloration in some cases, is what they are selecting for. These females are looking for. But it's interesting. So they do this on social cues as well as these color-based cues, so we can see the males. And they'll actually mate with different males in one lifetime, but they have no interest in the males after mating. So beyond that, the males are essentially just a big packet of sperm. They don't really care about parental care or any of these other things. So that's really makes this species a good model to do this kind of study, because there's no parental care after the fact. Adult males will pursue and court females as well, so there's this darting and trailing behavior. So we do have to look into this, so I'll talk about that in a second. So I did have to measure some of these variables to make sure that the social cues weren't the reason behind the behavioral change. But we have seen that, so in the wild we've seen that behavior occurs, so I wanted to see if this happens in the lab. And we also know, actually I should mention, we know that predation risk does shape the behavior of mating in these Trinidadian guppies, but we don't know exactly why. So there is an evolutionary component that has been looked at by other researchers, so it makes this another reason why this is a very good model. So what I've done is essentially set up these tanks that you can see right on the bottom. Had these females in these tanks, and these were F1 generation females, so the first generation to be born in a lab. And in these tanks, I had 7 females, fed them every day, and after they were acclimated, they were then given a certain treatment. The treatment they were given was either disturbance cue, alarm cue, or control, so I could look at kind of these different effects. And they were also then given a visual predator to associate with that cue, because we don't want to see decline. If we keep giving them cue, but there's nothing scaring them, they may eventually actually learn that this is not an important cue to look into, so just ignore it. So I wanted to make sure they were just being scared every time this cue was being given. They were given this for 3 days, and on day 4, they were tested. And the way they were tested is in these 2 side tanks were males, so you might get a nice bright blue male over here, a nice dull male over here, and the female was put in the center in this clear cylinder. You can see that from the back. And there was a clear cylinder in the center. There were also these 2 opaque barriers put on either side, and what I did was, for the first 5 minutes, I let the female get used to the environment. Then I took out these opaque barriers, so she was still in the cylinder, and she could see the 2 males, and they could see her, but she couldn't make a choice just yet. She was in the center. At which point, after 5 minutes, I removed the cylinder, and I recorded for a certain amount of time, essentially which choice she made. All her movement, I used a GoPro station above to see how she moved. I also recorded male behaviors to make sure that they were more or less controlled for in my later analysis. And so the way the tests were, it was done through that. At the end of that period of time where I was recording, I put the opaque barriers back in, I swapped the tanks so there wouldn't be a side bias, and then I ran that test again. And everything was then analyzed later on. I used Boris, which is a type of behavioral research, it's an ethology platform. It's free, it's open source, if anyone is interested in that. And I use that essentially to measure all different behaviors that are taking place on both the male side as well as the female side. Use Photoshop and Image J to measure the actual coloration of the males to get an idea of making sure I had quite literally the blue or the very bright colored male and the dull male. And I looked at these different behaviors. So you can see a number of male behaviors as well, from body length, coloration, things like that. Gonopodial thrust and sigmoidal displays are the darting and trailing behaviors that males display. They put on a show for the females. But really my main interest was in these 4 bold categories. So female latency to enter, the number of line crosses, so how much time she spent going towards the male, the time that she spent with the colorful male, and then the amount of time that she spent on both sides. This is something we call sexual activity. And so what I found, in terms of those different variables, the amount of time she took to make her first choice, there was no real difference. Sampling frequencies, how many of those line crosses she made, that's where there was a difference. Preferred choice, there was no difference. And then sexual activity, their overall behavior, there was a difference. So what I saw was that when you gave a disturbance cue, 2 of these, sampling frequency and the amount of sexual activity she had, so overall movement, they were significantly different. In an alarm cue, there was no change. And so that, to me, was very, very interesting. And so I wanted to see, why is it that when you give them a really strong threat, they don't change their behavior at all, but when you give them a little bit of threat, then they tend to change. My guess to this is that there were lots of opportunities. So when we're looking at things behind this mating behavior, There's a cost of losing these mating opportunities if they were too scared. So they might have thought, okay, well, there's something getting eaten in the water. I can smell this alarm cue, so I may as well just mate as quickly as possible and just don't change anything because I might get eaten regardless. So I may as well just focus on that and then ignore. But with disturbance cue, it might have been more of a, well, there might be something going wrong, but so I'll just be a bit more cautious. But it's not so scary that I better just go for it. The other thing I'm thinking is something called Weber's Law. And Weber's Law is the ability of an individual discriminating that difference in the stimuli changes as the stimuli size is increased. And so what I was thinking is maybe as we increase the threat level with the alarm cue, what we end up seeing is that in fact this is kind of an aspect of Weber's Law where we're seeing that the ability to discriminate between these stimuli was effectively not being changed. So it was becoming harder, more or less, to see these differences when you increased the level of threat. It's kind of bringing that threshold down. And this was important for a number of reasons. One, to kind of go back to the reasons why mate selection is important. It does influence the rate of evolution through sexual selection, so it gives us a bit more information on that, information on evolutionary history and what might be heritable in terms of these behaviors. It might explain some of these differences in the behaviors and evolution of these secondary sexual characteristics like coloration and behavior. So male behavior, I forgot to mention, I just use it as a control to make sure that the behavior is not affecting my results. And then also looking at the robustness of these male traits. So that's where I was kind of interested to see, well, if we change the threat level, how strongly are these traits being selected for? And that brings me right to maternal effects. And so I want to really quickly jump into this. So what are maternal effects? They are effectively when the female's phenotype affects the phenotype of her offspring. And so when we look at it from this definition, we do see that in fact, mate choice is a form of maternal effect. It isn't necessarily thought of that way. There are different schools of thought when it comes to whether or not to include it, but it is, when we look at it from a phenotype perspective, it is a type of maternal effect. There's a number of different examples. So female mate selection is one, offspring size, how these offspring are dispersed, parental care provisioning, protecting them from others, and just anything to do with learning and growth and survival of the offspring that's linked to the female's phenotype. And we're looking at behavior as a phenotype, as a heritable phenotype of the species. And so that's where.
One very important maternal effect.
Did I? Yeah.
Which is present in bonobos, where maternal offspring are actually aided by the dominant mother in mating.
Oh, it's yeah. Well, there's a lot. Yeah, that's the thing. It ends up being.
That's very direct.
Yeah.
Very complex.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the case. Yeah, I remember reading about that recently. I mean, again, anything that comes into that behavior of offspring, I guess you can kind of chuck into the bottom category. But again, it's the female's phenotype is affecting. That does sound like a very complex issue, especially when we're looking at dominance hierarchies and how that can then influence mate selection as well. It's a really fascinating topic. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago. It's about 700 pages long that just delves into this.
Dominance is inherited.
Yeah.
As in hyenas.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. And then the other question is why, like, how is it inherited? Is it directly from genetics? Is it that they kind of maintain this strategy? Can they lose that dominance as well? As we can see chimps, for example, chimpanzees will fight for the dominant position. There's a lot of different really interesting factors when it comes to mate selection. I could go into it forever, but I don't want to lock you guys in a room for 3 days while I'm talking at you. But I will talk a little bit more about these maternal effects. There are 4 major types of maternal effects. There are anticipatory maternal effects, and these all, again, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, that how important the environmental context is. In some cases, if the mother can anticipate the environment that's coming up, she might then put more maternal provisioning into the eggs, for example, give more nutrients. This might lead to offspring that are larger, it might lead to offspring that are better able to disperse. We see using crickets, for example, and certain species of frogs. But effectively it needs there to be a fairly consistent environmental pattern that takes place. On the other hand, if the environment is not very predictable, the mother might go into something called bet hedging maternal effects. And what that means is she'll create offspring with much larger variation in their phenotype. So she might get some small-legged sons, some larger-legged sons, things like that. And what ends up happening is this spreads that risk out. So that's accepting that some of those offspring will not do well, but other offspring will do very well. And this is to make sure that regardless of what the upcoming environment is, these offspring, at least some of those genes will continue on towards the next generation. So it spreads that risk over space and over time. But another way we used to look at maternal effects, it was called adaptive transgenerational plasticity. But the reality is they're not always adaptive, and I'll show you these in the last two examples of maternal effects. One of them are selfish maternal effects. In some cases, if the environment is again predictable, the mother might decide, well, you know what, there is this pattern that occurs where the environment will get better. Let's say if we're looking at drought situations, and she might actually put less effort into maintaining eggs, because holding these eggs can be costly. So she might, in some cases, in there's certain insect species, they'll just drop the eggs wherever they go without really caring whether or not there's an actual food source around for the offspring. And she might also just put less nutrients into those eggs in general, and then that will lead to these reduced size of the offspring. So that requires a predictable pattern to occur. She kind of knows, I don't want to use that term, but she's anticipating a negative or a better environment to come, and so she may as well just kind of scrap these eggs and ignore them. And the last one are these transmissive maternal effects. This is kind of not really on part of the amount of provisioning that occurs. There's cases where pathogens and parasites can move over from the mother to the offspring. There could also be exposure that the mother has to toxins if she's in an environment where she's foraging that has been contaminated. These will continue on into the offspring as well. It's an effect of her phenotype right there. And so I'm going to close with just this last experiment here. And this is the second experiment. So what I want to see is, again, looking at predation, I want to see whether or not the offspring behavior would change if the mothers were actually given this elevated predation risk. So I look at the mate choice, and I want to see what happens to the offspring. Looked at a number of different behaviors, so darting behaviors, speed of movement, so velocity, how much they move in general, how quickly they turned, or sharp their turns were, and the amount of times they were moving in general around the central area was. And effectively, if I had to kind of just give you an illustration as to what I'm looking for, it's that animals, that the offspring that are not afraid, they're coming from mothers that are not afraid, they'll kind of be more laid back, they'll make more slower movements, they won't turn as much, they'll just be really calm. Whereas those that are from mothers that are afraid might dart a lot more, they may make very quick turns, and their overall movement will be very, very kind of jagged. So that was what I was predicting. And so to do that, I had a very similar setup to what I showed you earlier. I had different aquariums, put 4 pregnant females in each one, or 4 females, put a male in there to make sure for sure they were pregnant, and for about 3 days, and I took the male out, and then I started my treatment. And so what I did for this treatment was I gave them control or disturbance cue to these females, and I did this until the experiment was done, until I had enough offspring to measure. And at the beginning of each day, I would actually take out any offspring and test them. And the way I tested them was using something called neophobia. I'll really quickly just to mention what neophobia is. It's increased predator avoidance when you're responding towards something new. So the idea that because predation risk is it can be variable, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, there is a selection for prey species to be able to behave differently towards new things based on their previous predation risk. There is this heritable component to that. And this is because it reduces the learning cost in naive prey, because you don't want the only way for this prey to learn about predators to be attacked by one. Neophobia helps to kind of control that a little bit. To test them, I put them into a light box and put a big petri dish in the middle and had these little fish fries swimming on them. I recorded that, and then I analyzed those motions in a package known as TRAG-R in the R programming language. And again, these were the same variables I mentioned earlier, so things like darting, velocity, the amount of distance traveled, how quickly they turned, and just their overall movement. And I'm currently still analyzing those results. I'm really excited to see what's happening. Just anecdotally, it does look like there is a difference in the behavior. It does seem to follow that trend that we originally thought. There's a lot of work that looks into the maternal effects of these stressed mothers and how they're moving chemicals across this egg membrane while they're still holding them. And in fact, it makes it very interesting because there's even possible that they can change that behavior based on how long they're stressed for. But in that case, it looks like this is there may be something there. So I'm really excited to have those results. They'll be out pretty soon. As soon as they're finished up, I will let you know. And then in terms of just kind of next steps, so I'm analyzing these behaviors. Currently, as I mentioned, I'm here on the Shashi Fellowship. I'll be happy to answer any questions about that as well. It's Indo-Canadian Fellowship, so they bring students from Canada, India, and vice versa. So if you're interested in studying in Canada, that is one option. But the main goal is really just to interact with researchers here, meet professors, meet students, just really share these ideas. And so please do not be shy, to talk and answer. Ask me anything you want. Just hang out in general, go for, coffee or tea or anything. I'm really, really excited. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm really excited to be here. Hopefully I gave you some dating advice. I don't know, but you can maybe tell people that you got some good advice about female mate choice. Need to, have to thank all these different people. Professor Pondicherry here. Thank you for hosting us. My supervisors here and back home, my lab members, my family members. I can't be here on this planet without them, and these undergraduate students that I've had the pleasure of both mentoring and working with on these different projects. Science is not an independent thing. It requires collaborations. It requires work with many people, and I'm very, very much indebted to all of their help. And of course, we can never not thank our funding agencies. Their help is instrumental in coming here and doing this work. And feel free to shoot me an email, follow me on Instagram. I do science communication stuff, giving talks around India about scientific communication, manuscript writing, that kind of thing. So I'm happy to answer questions on that as well. You can see me on my website. My very long name is the one, although I guess it's not that long here. In Canada, my name is considered really long, which I think is kind of interesting. But here, I think I'm a little bit safer. That's it. So thank you very much for your time.